The coalition warship had no name anymore. Whatever designation it had carried before the war had been burned off with the rest of its hull markings during the third engagement over Viltrum's orbital shell. Now it was just a shape, a wounded, listing shape-holding position above Earth, at an altitude where the planet below looked deceptively peaceful. The way all things looked deceptively peaceful from far enough away. The planet itself was quiet from this distance, its cloud systems moving with the patient indifference of systems that did not register the violence that had occurred in the space above them. Whatever Earth knew about the last several years of cosmic upheaval, it had absorbed and continued. That capacity for absorption was, Thragg had been noting for some time now, the most underestimated property of the species below. The surviving Viltrumites assembled in what had been the ship's primary operations bay. The ceiling was partially collapsed on the starboard side, and someone had moved the debris into a rough perimeter that functioned, without anyone deciding it would. As a boundary for the gathering, fewer than a dozen of them. What remained after a virus, a war fought across the outer systems, and the attrition of a species that had spent 10,000 years building itself into something functionally invincible, and had discovered, in the span of a single generation, the precise limits of that invincibility. The number represented a failure of such comprehensive magnitude that quantifying it was almost beside the point. The most capable warrior civilization in the known galaxy, reduced to this. A damaged room above a small planet that had refused to accept its assigned outcome. Thragg stood at the back. He stood the way he always stood, still, fully upright, occupying space with the specific quality of someone who had never once in 3,000 years needed to make himself larger to be taken seriously. His arms were at his sides. His face was the face he had maintained through the entirety of the war's collapse, not blank, exactly, but processed. Every expression Thragg wore was a considered output, not a reflex. He had learned this distinction early, in the 2nd century of his life, when he had recognized that other Viltrumites read faces the way they read terrain, as information, as advantage or vulnerability. He had made his face into a document that said only what he intended it to say, and he had maintained that discipline across 30 centuries without deviation. The habit was so complete that he could no longer clearly identify the moment he had formed it. It had simply become the texture of his consciousness. Mark Grayson stood at the front. He was still in the suit. There were repairs on it that had been made quickly and showed it. The seams at the left shoulder were wrong, the coloring uneven where the material had been replaced in a hurry after the last engagement. He had the posture of someone carrying weight they had not yet fully catalogued, the specific exhaustion of a person who had won something and had not yet determined what winning cost. He was young. He was far younger than anyone else in this room had any right to be while occupying this kind of moment, and the room knew it, and Thragg had been thinking about that fact with sustained attention since the battle's last engagement. He spoke without notes. He spoke the way someone spoke when they had rehearsed something so many times that the rehearsal had burned off and what was left was just the actual content, delivered plainly and without theater. He talked about Earth, about the arrangement, about what integration could look like if everyone in this room chose to pursue it honestly and completely. He talked about the future with the specific conviction of someone who believed in it not as strategy but as genuine orientation, who was looking at the future the way most beings looked at the present, with unshielded attention, as if it were already real enough to stand in. He used the word together 4 times in 11 minutes. He did not appear to notice. Thragg listened. He had been cataloging Mark Grayson since before the war ended. The file was extensive and, in certain respects, the most technically interesting assessment he had compiled in centuries. What made Invincible dangerous was not his raw physical capability, significant, growing toward something formidable, but not exceptional by Viltrumite standards at full cohort strength. What made him dangerous was the specific quality of his conviction. He did not fight to win. He fought because he could not accept losing. The distinction was not semantic. A combatant who fights to win makes calculations about acceptable costs and exits when those costs exceed the projected gain. A combatant who cannot accept losing does not perform that calculation. He had watched Mark take damage in the final engagements that any tactically rational being would have recognized as a clear and unambiguous signal to withdraw. Mark had not withdrawn, he had continued. The body had simply kept expressing what the mind refused to revise. Formidable, more dangerous than his power alone suggests, because his power is amplified by the irrationality of belief. He will die for these creatures. That is not a weakness I can exploit directly. It is a variable I must account for in every subsequent model. He moved his attention to the other Viltrumites in the room. He read them the way he had read rooms for 3 millennia, the precise body language of beings whose culture had trained them to suppress emotional expression, which meant that the emotions that leaked through were significant by definition. He saw resignation in 2 of them, the specific muscle tension around the jaw and orbital bones of beings who had accepted an outcome they had not chosen and were now simply processing the fact of it. He saw grudging pragmatism in 3 others, the orientation of soldiers who had lost a campaign and were already calculating how to make the new terrain workable, how to find in defeat the conditions for something that was not defeat. He saw genuine disgust in 1, imperfectly concealed, the ideological revulsion of a being who still believed in Viltrumite superiority and had nowhere to put that belief anymore. No institution to receive it, no war to give it purpose. And in the last one, a younger warrior named Krios, barely 4 centuries old by Viltrumite reckoning, still in the early decades of his full physical maturity, he saw something he had not expected. Relief. The war was over, and Krios was relieved. Thragg filed this without allocating additional attention to it. It was data. It suggested that the ideological cohesion of the remaining Viltrumites was weaker than even the war's outcome implied. A species whose youngest surviving member felt relief at the end of the campaign it had been built to execute was a species whose internal architecture had already begun to fail. Mark finished speaking. He looked at the room and waited. The Viltrumites looked at each other and then, in the way of beings who have no institutional structure left to refer to, at Thragg. He did not acknowledge the looks. He looked at Mark. "Your terms are acceptable," he said. The ship was quiet after the others dispersed to begin their own calculations about where and how to start. Thragg remained in the bay for a long time after they left. He was running, simultaneously, several models against each other, testing their outputs against what he had observed in the last hour, revising where the data required revision. This was not unusual. He had spent 3,000 years doing precisely this, running models, revising, acting on the output of the revision. What was unusual was the specific character of what the models were telling him now, which was something none of his previous models had ever had to accommodate. The canonical error of the Viltrumite Empire, the error he had administered for 3,000 years without recognizing as an error, was now visible to him with the clarity that only catastrophic failure produced. They had built soldiers, perfect, near indestructible, absolutely committed soldiers. And soldiers required enemies, which meant the Empire's entire operational logic was predicated on there always being something to fight. Remove the enemy and you revealed the emptiness underneath the doctrine. The Scourge virus had not killed the Empire. The emptiness had. The virus had simply been the first thing to walk through a door that the Empire's own rigidity had left permanently open. What had defeated that army was not a superior army. It was a network. He had been trying to understand this since Nolan Grayson chose Earth over the Empire the first time, had been trying to model how a Viltrumite of Nolan's capabilities and discipline could be restructured by decades among humans into something that would fight against Viltrum. The answer he had arrived at, standing in that bay above Earth, was the one he had been avoiding because it had no place in any model the Empire had ever built. Belonging. Nolan had not defected because he loved the woman, or the boy, or even the planet in any abstract sense. He had defected because he had become part of a system, a web of mutual investment and interdependence so complete that leaving it was no longer a decision available to him in any meaningful way. He could not leave any more than a cell could leave a body and continue to function as itself. The Empire had spent millennia trying to eliminate that quality from Viltrumite psychology. Strip out the dependencies, the attachments, the vulnerabilities. Produce a pure instrument. And a pure instrument, it turned out, could be broken by something that was not an instrument at all. Something that fought, not because it was built to fight, but because it could not imagine not fighting for the things it was embedded in. Thragg stood in the bay and looked at Earth through the warship's damaged viewport, and did not feel what a lesser mind might have called humility. He felt something colder and more useful: recognition. He had identified the mechanism of his defeat with enough precision to understand that it was also the mechanism of a potential victory, one that looked nothing like any victory the Empire had ever pursued. He would not maintain separation. He would not preserve Viltrumite identity in isolated purity and wait for an opportunity that the coalition would spend the next century ensuring never arrived. That was the move his enemies expected. That was the move they were building their defenses against right now. In the conversations Mark Grayson was already beginning with Cecil Stedman, he would instead do something no Viltrumite had ever done deliberately and survived. He would go inside. Not the way Nolan had gone inside, stumbling into belonging through proximity and time until it consumed him. He would go inside the way a strategist entered occupied territory. Eyes open, objectives defined, exit conditions established before entry. He would study the mechanism of human belonging with the same total commitment he had applied to every other instrument of power in 3,000 years of administration. And then he would build a version of it that he controlled, not a body he was part of, a body he owned. During the final chaotic weeks of the war, in the hours when the archive systems were accessible and inadequately monitored, he had confirmed something he had suspected for a long time. The bloodline. The records the Council had maintained in secret for 30 centuries. The lineage they had excised from every public document. The dynasty they had buried so completely that its existence had become the kind of thing that could only be found by someone who already knew where to look. He had known where to look. He had read the records in the 47 minutes the systems remained accessible, and then the records burned, and he carried what he had read without sharing it with anyone, which was the only way he had ever held anything of real value. He had the name. He would use it. He descended to Earth on a Thursday afternoon in November. No announcement. No ceremony. The other Viltrumites were making their entries with varying degrees of coordination with the Gita, some meeting with Cecil Stedman's people directly, some working through Mark as an intermediary, all of them navigating the specific awkwardness of being welcomed by a species they had been sent to conquer. Thragg had no interest in being welcomed. He had interest in being studied, and then in disappearing into the texture of what he had studied. And the two requirements were mutually exclusive with public arrival protocols. He walked through a city. He had selected Chicago because its scale and demographic density provided the most compressed survey environment available at this latitude. A city of that size and character contained, in something approaching microcosm, every major category of human social organization. Institutional, commercial, recreational, religious, communal, political, and the proximity of those categories to each other meant he could move through all of them in a single sustained observation period without the transit time that a more dispersed environment would have required. He moved through it for 6 hours. He did not speak to anyone unless spoken to, and when spoken to he responded in the minimal way that produced no further conversation. He went to a public market, a hospital, a park, a political rally in a civic auditorium, a church service of a denomination he selected for its communal density, and a bar showing a sporting event. He moved through each environment with the unhurried attention of a naturalist in an unfamiliar ecosystem, taking in everything, committing to nothing, leaving no record. At the market, he watched the commerce of necessity conduct itself with its layered social texture. The specific negotiations between vendor and customer that were never entirely about the transaction itself. The way strangers navigated proximity in a crowded space with the unconscious choreography of a species that had learned to live in dense aggregations without constant conflict. He noted the mechanisms of small trust, the cashier who recognized a regular customer, and the brief acknowledgement that passed between them, the subtle change in quality that recognition produced, the way neither participant appeared to consciously register any of this while it was happening. At the hospital, he watched a family receive bad news in a corridor near the oncology ward. The collapse was immediate and total, one person's structural failure propagating to the others around them with no physical contact required, distress moving through the group like a pressure wave through water. And then the stabilization. They reached for each other. Physical contact. The wave arrested. They built, in a matter of seconds, something more structurally resistant than any individual among them had been alone. A composite organism, more durable than its components. This is not weakness. This is distributed load-bearing. I fought against this, and did not understand that I was fighting a structural principle, not a character flaw. At the park, a child fell from a bicycle. A man, not the child's parent, not anyone the child knew, a stranger with a coffee and somewhere else to be, stopped. He helped the child up. He said something that made the child laugh. He walked on. The child rode away. The transaction was complete. Neither participant would remember it by the end of the week. Thragg stood on the path where this had occurred and looked at the space the stranger had occupied. He stood there long enough that a woman with a dog gave him a careful, curious look and altered her path slightly to maintain distance. He was not moved by what he had witnessed. He was not capable of being moved by it in the way the stranger had been moved to stop. But he understood it. For the first time, with a completeness he had not previously achieved, they built credit in accounts that no individual would ever draw from. Goodwill distributed across a system so vast and interconnected that it could absorb the loss of any single node without structural failure. And then, the crucial element, they defended the system. Not any specific person. The system. The web of obligation and mutual investment that made individual survival feel meaningful. He had been trying to understand why Nolan chose them. He understood now. And he understood something else. Something Nolan had never understood about his own defection. Because Nolan had been inside the process and could not see its shape, the mechanism could be replicated. Not experienced, he would never experience it, had no architecture for genuine belonging, and had no interest in acquiring one. But replicated. Constructed, placed under management. He walked to a government office on LaSalle Street. He waited in line for 23 minutes. He filled out the forms with the precise, efficient handwriting of someone for whom a pen was simply another instrument. He listed his name as Thomas Argall. He provided documentation that was perfect in every respect, because he had spent the flight down from the warship constructing it to be perfect in every respect, using access to systems and records that would not have been traceable to any individual, and that he had secured with the same thoroughness he brought to logistics. He signed the form. The name was a private observation he would share with no one. Argall, the founding dynasty, the original bloodline, the lineage the council had spent 3,000 years burying so completely that even the man who was the last of it had needed to find his own records in a burning archive during the final hours of a losing war. He wore it as an alias because the private irony of it suited him in the way that only a mind with no one adequate to share it with could be suited, completely and in absolute silence. He walked back out into the November afternoon. Above him, the city moved. He began to study it. The first thing Thomas Argall did was fail, not visibly, not in any way that produced a record or a witness or a correctable data point in anyone else's model. He failed privately, in the third week of his residency, when he attempted his first extended social interaction with a group of humans at a neighborhood association meeting in Lincoln Park, and found that his initial calibration was wrong. He had modeled the interaction based on his 6 hours of observation. He had prepared language. He had constructed a persona with the same thoroughness he applied to military logistics, the backstory, the vocal register, the precise degree of eye contact that human social literature identified as confidence without aggression. He deployed it. The room responded with the specific, polite coolness of people who sensed something they could not name and defaulted to distance. The invisible instrument of social threat detection, refined across hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, had registered something and could not identify what it was, and therefore produced wariness as its output. He left the meeting. He walked home. He sat in the apartment he had rented, bare, functional, containing only what was operationally necessary, and he ran the diagnostic. The error was elementary once he identified it. He had been modeling human social behavior from observation. Observation produced data about outputs. It told him nothing adequate about the mechanism that generated them. He knew what humans did when they trusted each other. He did not yet know what trust felt like from the inside, which meant he could not accurately simulate its production. He was performing the result without understanding the process, and humans, specifically the social threat detection apparatus that evolution had built and refined over geological time, could feel the gap between the performance and the real thing with a precision that their conscious minds could not articulate, but their bodies registered without fail. He spent the next 4 months not performing. He listened. He found environments where listening was the expected behavior, and he used them exhaustively. Lectures at 4 different universities, religious services of 6 different traditions, community support groups he attended under false credentials, political organizing meetings, late-night conversations in bars where strangers told each other things they would not tell their families. He did not attempt connection. He cataloged what connection looked like when it was real, with a granularity that no human researcher had ever achieved, because no human researcher had ever approached the subject with 3,000 years of pattern recognition experience and no emotional interference distorting the data. By month 5, he knew the difference between a genuine laugh and a social laugh with a precision that could not be formally documented, because the distinction operated below the threshold of any instrument humans had built to measure it. He knew the specific microcontraction of the orbicularis oculi that distinguished real amusement from performed politeness. He knew the subtle postural shift that preceded genuine interest as opposed to obligatory attention. He knew, in detail sufficient to reproduce, what it looked and sounded and moved like when a human being stopped performing and started being present. He went back to the Lincoln Park Neighborhood Association. The room received him entirely differently. He could not have explained, if asked, what he had changed. That was the point. The mechanism, once understood, became invisible in its application. The money came first because money was the simplest system. Human economics, viewed from outside and analyzed by a mind with complete emotional neutrality and superior information processing capacity, was not complicated. It was a resource allocation mechanism built on imperfect information and emotional decision-making, which meant that any actor with those 2 disqualifications removed could locate and exploit its inefficiencies with something approaching mathematical certainty. He identified structural gaps in the technology infrastructure market within his first year, not through insider access or illegal means, but through the straightforward application of a mind that could hold more variables simultaneously than any human analyst, and had no cognitive bias toward optimistic projections. He invested. The investments returned. He reinvested at a scale that required corporate structure, which he built with the same meticulous attention to legal compliance that characterized everything he constructed in this phase. Within 2 years, Thomas Argall was worth $11 billion. Within 4, he was among the 20 wealthiest individuals on Earth. A financial journalist named Sandra Okafor wrote a profile of his rise for a major publication in year 3. She was good, methodical, skeptical, thorough in the specific way of someone who had been burned by a subject before and had built better practices around the scar tissue. She spent 6 weeks on the piece and found nothing. What she did not find, because it was not findable, was the time Thragg had spent before their first meeting reviewing everything publicly available about her life, her professional history, the stories she was most proud of and the ones she still thought she had gotten wrong, the editor she trusted and the one she didn't, the specific shape of the career she was trying to build. He had prepared the way a surgeon prepared before an operation, not because he found it interesting, but because precise knowledge of the terrain was the precondition for not making mistakes. The profile ran positive. Sandra Okafor became an asset. The distinction mattered only to him. The Argall Foundation was incorporated in year 2. Its stated mission, education access, veteran support, technological literacy, and the advancement of Earth Viltrumite cultural understanding. Its actual function was more precise. Each program area was a designed system for producing a specific output, and the operational genius of the design was that the stated mission and the actual function were identical at every level that could be observed from the outside. The education programs built loyalty in communities that traditional institutions had failed. The specific, durable loyalty of people who associated Thomas Argall with the concrete improvement of their children's lives. The programs were real. The improvements were real. Children who went through the Foundation's partner schools tested higher and graduated at higher rates than comparable populations, and the research backing those outcomes had been independently verified by 3 separate academic institutions. The loyalty was earned. That it was also useful was simply the operational elegance of a plan designed so that its cover story was true at every point where a cover story could be tested. The veteran support programs identified and cultivated relationships with individuals who had the psychological profile Thragg found most valuable: strong in group loyalty, comfort with institutional hierarchy, and a tendency towards systems-level thinking rather than purely individual self-interest. He was not recruiting them. He was building proximity, goodwill, and the kind of social debt that produced, over years, people who would take his calls and listen to what he had to say with an openness that had been earned rather than purchased. The Cultural Exchange Initiative was the most publicly visible program and the most structurally complex. It gave him a legitimate reason to maintain regular contact with other Viltrumites who had integrated into Earth society. It gave him a platform to shape the narrative of that integration in ways that were subtle enough to be invisible and consistent enough to be cumulative. And it placed him, visibly and repeatedly, at the center of the story of Earth-Viltrumite harmony, so that any future challenge to his character could be framed, immediately, as a challenge to that harmony itself. In year 3, he expanded into political adjacency. Not elected office, that would invite a specific quality of scrutiny that his documentation, however perfect, had limits in withstanding over the long arc of a public career. Instead, he funded think tanks, cultivated relationships with legislative staffers, and made himself useful to the kind of people who shaped policy without appearing in its public face. He sponsored academic research in fields that would matter. The research was legitimate. The findings were published openly. 3 years in, he had ongoing relationships with individuals in 3 legislative bodies who considered Thomas Argall a trusted source on questions of alien integration policy. None of them had been asked to do anything that violated their professional ethics. All of them were, in ways they could not map and would not have believed, pieces of something that had a shape they could not see from where they were standing. He thought of it not as a foundation but as infrastructure. The same way a military campaign required roads, supply lines, and communication networks before the first engagement, what he was building required financial, political, informational, and social infrastructure before anything else could move. He was building roads. He was laying pipe. He was stringing wire through the walls of an institution that did not yet know it was under construction. Cecil Stedman had a file on Thomas Argall that was, by year 3, the most intensely reviewed document in the GDA's active intelligence catalog. He sat with it on a Tuesday evening in his office, the overhead lights off, the desk lamp on. The specific atmosphere of a man who did his best thinking in conditions that looked, from the outside, like someone who had forgotten to go home. He had been doing this for 40 years. He had built institutions designed to catch threats, and he had a particular sensitivity, refined across 4 decades of adversarial professional experience, to the specific texture of something that was trying not to be caught. The file was clean in a way that bothered him, not the clean of an honest record, the clean of a constructed one. Real lives had rough edges, missed payments, expired licenses, old relationships that ended badly, minor legal disputes, the accumulated friction of a human being moving through systems designed by other human beings. Thomas Argall's documentation had none of this. Every record was current. Every affiliation was legitimate. Every financial disclosure was accurate and unremarkable. The roughest edge in the entire file was a noise complaint from a neighbor in year 1 that had been resolved the same day. Cecil lit a cigar. He did not smoke it. He held it. He had built fabricated identities. He knew what they looked like when they were good. The fabrications he was most proud of had rough edges. He added them deliberately, because he understood that a frictionless identity was its own kind of tell to anyone looking for the right thing. The fact that Argall's file was frictionless told Cecil that whoever built it understood that too, and had a level of access and resources that could produce friction-free documentation that also felt real. That required something beyond technical capability. It required an understanding of what real looked like that went beyond research. He picked up his desk phone. He called Mark. "I need you to look at something," he said. Mark came in the next morning. He sat across from Cecil and looked at the file for 20 minutes without speaking. Then, "He's doing everything right. Yes, the foundation, the programs, the cultural initiative. They're actually good, Cecil. The education outcomes in the communities they're working in are measurably, I know what the outcomes are." Mark set the file down. "Then, what are we looking at?" Cecil finally lit the cigar. "We are looking at a man who was the Grand Regent of an interstellar empire for 3,000 years. Who administered the pacification of thousands of planets, who built and maintained a military and political apparatus of extraordinary complexity across millennia." He exhaled. "And we are asking ourselves whether that man, given several years of preparation and unlimited resources, is capable of producing a philanthropic foundation with clean documentation." Mark looked at him. "He's doing everything right," Cecil said, "because he has spent 3,000 years learning what right looks like. The file isn't evidence of innocence. It's evidence of sophistication. You can't surveil someone for being sophisticated." "No," Cecil said. "You cannot." He put the file back in the drawer and didn't throw it away, because a man in his position didn't throw things away. He filed them and waited, and kept his eyes on the spaces where evidence should eventually appear, not because he expected it soon, but because patience was the only instrument that worked on things that moved slowly and knew how to move slowly without being told. The gala was held in year 5, in a ballroom in Midtown Manhattan that had been built in 1931, and had the specific quality of places that had absorbed enough human occasion to feel weighted by it. Not haunted, exactly, but densified, as if the accumulated significance of events held there had changed the material properties of the room itself. Thomas Argall received the award with remarks that ran for 11 minutes and were, by any objective measure, the best public speech delivered at that event in its 40-year history. He was specific where most speakers were general. He was honest about difficulty where most speakers performed effortlessness. He said the word failure twice in reference to his own early efforts, with the precise degree of vulnerability that produced trust rather than doubt. He talked about the Viltrumite War in language that was not the managed, press-ready acknowledgement of historical harm he used in public statements. It was something closer to what a person said about something they had lived through and were still inside, still carrying. The crowd received it the way crowds received things that felt true rather than performed. The standing ovation lasted longer than the introduction. Mark was there because Eve had been right when she said that suspicious distance was its own problem, that absence. In the media architecture Argall had spent 5 years constructing, would be interpreted not as appropriate skepticism, but as the specific refusal of the one person whose endorsement would matter most. He stood near the back during the speech and listened and found, against everything he wanted to find, that the speech was good. Not good the way a performance was good. Good the way something true was good. Which was, he was beginning to understand, a more sophisticated problem than he had adequate words for yet. Argall worked the room after. He moved through it with the ease of someone who had studied crowds for a very long time, always facing the room, always positioned so that no one was behind him, always leaving interactions at the moment where the other person felt satisfied rather than finished. Mark watched him work and felt the specific unease of someone observing expertise in a field they could not formally name. Argall reached him. He extended his hand. Invincible. His grip was warm. Calibrated. It means everything that you came tonight. I know some of your concerns about me are significant. I want you to know I understand them. Mark looked at him. Do you? I do. He held Mark's eyes with the practiced directness of someone who understood that looking away first was a social concession. And I want you to know that I hope, eventually, to earn your trust. He held the handshake 1 beat longer than was necessary. Not threatening, demonstrating. Then he released it and turned to the next person in the room before Mark could respond, with the smooth, unhurried continuity of someone who had planned the interaction to end at exactly that moment. Mark stood in the ballroom with the ghost of a handshake and the feeling, precise and unnameable, that something had just happened that he did not understand. He was right. He did not understand it. That was entirely the point. The compound sat on 400 acres of private land in northern Montana, 3 miles from the nearest paved road and 11 from the nearest town. It was legal. Every permit, every environmental assessment, every building inspection had been completed correctly and on time. The county assessor's office had it listed as a private educational and research retreat. The 2 state inspectors who had visited in the past 3 years had filed reports describing well-maintained facilities, appropriate safety infrastructure, and a small residential population of children receiving what appeared to be an exceptionally rigorous homeschooling curriculum. Both inspectors had left with the specific satisfaction of people who had done their jobs thoroughly and found nothing wrong. Neither had been coerced. Neither had been compromised. Thragg had simply ensured, in the months before each inspection, that what they would find was exactly what the permits described. This was not difficult. He had been managing inspections of far greater complexity for 3 millennia. The buildings were low and functional, built from materials Thragg had selected not for aesthetics, but for acoustic and electromagnetic properties. The specific material choices of someone who had considered the compound's physical characteristics as carefully as any commander considered the geometry of a fortified position. The largest structure was the central hall, an open, high-ceilinged space that served as classroom, dining area, and assembly room depending on the time of day. The smaller structures radiated outward from it in a pattern that looked, from satellite imagery, like a residential campus of modest ambition. There were 19 children at this point, ranging in apparent age from early childhood to late adolescence. They were not all the same developmental stage. Thragg had been running the program as an experiment, adjusting variables, rate of physical maturation, intensity of the educational curriculum, the proportion of Viltrumite heritage documentation to human cultural exposure, across different cohorts to calibrate the optimal output. What they shared, the specific physical signature of Viltrumite heritage, the density in the jaw, the unusual stillness at rest, the eyes that processed a room the way a camera processed a frame rather than the selective roving attention of purely human vision. And alongside that, moving through it like a second current, the full emotional range of their human inheritance, quick laughter, genuine anger, the particular intensity of adolescent loyalty, the way they touched each other's arms when one of them was struggling. They were, objectively, something that had not existed before. The question of what to do with that novelty had answers that depended entirely on who was asking it. They had been raised to understand both. They knew exactly what they were. Thragg had told them when they were old enough to hold the information, and had framed it with the only parenting philosophy he had studied closely enough to deploy with confidence: pride. Not Viltrumite pride in the old eliminative sense. The pride of being something new. Something that had not existed before. He had told them they were a synthesis rather than a compromise. And they had believed him the way children believed the first large truth they were given about themselves, completely, and as a foundation for everything built afterward. The eldest son was 16 in biological years. His name, in the compound's internal life, was Kalan, a Viltrumite word that did not translate precisely into English, but carried the approximate meaning of the edge that cuts both ways. Thragg had named all of them. The names were a private language, understood only within the compound's walls, and by the man who had built those walls to contain exactly the life that now unfolded inside them. Kalan had his father's physical architecture, the same structural density, the same economy of movement, the same capacity for absolute stillness. But where Thragg's stillness was the stillness of a calculating mind that needed no external input to remain occupied, Kalan's stillness was something different. It was the stillness of someone listening. He was, at his core, oriented toward other people in a way his father was not and would never be, and this orientation expressed itself in a searching, fierce attentiveness that the other children had learned to read as care, because that is what it was. He was not performing care. He experienced it in the full, uncomplicated way of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt that it was a quality worth having. He loved his father with the specific intensity of someone whose entire conceptual framework for what love meant had been built around one person. He watched Thragg with the hunger of a person trying to understand something they could feel but could not quite see. He catalogued the moments of what he interpreted as connection, the sessions where Thragg spoke about the future with something in his voice that felt like belief, the rare occasions when his father placed a hand on his shoulder and the pressure of it felt like approval. And he held them with more care than he held anything else. He did not know that his father had designed this. He did not have the framework to consider that question. The framework had been designed too. At night, when the compound had gone quiet and the younger children were settled, Kalan sometimes sat on the steps of the residential hall and looked at the Montana dark and felt the size of what was coming with something close to exhilaration. He believed in the future his father had described to him. He believed in it the way the converted believed, not as argument, but as territory, as the place where his life made sense, and without which nothing did. The eldest daughter was 14. Her name was Selah. She was the most tactically gifted of the children. Thragg had assessed this by year 3 of her development, and had quietly adjusted her curriculum to develop the capability further. She processed physical environments the way her father processed social ones, as systems with exploitable geometries, with weak points that became visible once you understood what the structure was trying to accomplish. This made her, in the operational picture he was building, the most valuable of the cohort. Not because she was the most physically capable, Kalan had an edge in raw strength, but because capability without tactical intelligence was an instrument. And Thragg had no use for instruments he already owned in abundance. She was also the one who sometimes stood at the compound's perimeter fence in the early morning, and looked at the mountains and felt something she had no language for. It was not unhappiness. The compound was home. The other children were her people in the most complete sense she understood that word. Kalan was her closest relation in the world, and she loved him with a directness that was one of her most thoroughly human qualities. Not the careful, instrumental love that the compound's architecture was designed to produce, but something messier and more real. The love of someone who had grown up beside another person and knew them in all their difficulty and chose them anyway. What she felt at the perimeter was a question without a subject, a sense that something she was supposed to see was not visible from where she was standing. She had tried to describe it to Kalan once in one of the late-night conversations on the residential hall steps. He had listened carefully, he always listened carefully, and then said that he thought she was describing the feeling of being ready for something. She had accepted this because he was probably right, and because the alternative, that she was perceiving an absence she couldn't name, something structural about the life she had been placed inside, was not something she had a framework to pursue. She was not ready to ask it. She did not pursue it. She went back inside. She worked on what she had been assigned. She was very good at working on what she had been assigned, and for a long time this was enough. On a Wednesday evening in the compound's 6th year, Thragg conducted the session that the children understood as philosophy, and that was, structurally, a military briefing delivered in the vocabulary of aspiration. He stood at the front of the assembly hall. 19 children in rows, some cross-legged on the floor, some in chairs, the youngest in the back with an older sibling beside them who would translate anything they didn't follow. The light was the warm, low light of evening, and the hall had the smell of the dinner that had been cleared away, something with bread, something with spices that one of the older children had developed a preference for and taught herself to make. He asked them what they believed in. They answered in the layered, overlapping way of people who had been asked this question before and had their answers ready but still meant them. Each other, the work, the future he had described to them since they were old enough to understand description. Him, he listened. He nodded at the appropriate intervals. Then a small child, one of the youngest, a girl of perhaps 6, stood up from the floor and walked to him with the confident, uncalculating directness of a young child who had never had a reason to approach her father with anything but certainty of welcome. She put her arms around his waist. He held her. He placed his hand on the back of her head with the correct pressure and the correct duration, the gesture landing with a completeness that made the child close her eyes. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Go on, now." She ran back to her place and sat down, satisfied. Thragg looked back at the assembled room. His internal accounting of the session's progress continued exactly where it had been before the child reached him. He noted, without allocating further attention to it, that the interaction had produced the expected effect on the other children, a visible relaxation, a confirmation of something they needed confirmed. He looked at Kalan, at Selah, at the others. "Good," he said. "The time for belief will end. The time for action is approaching. Review the structural analysis I assigned you. We proceed in phases." Kalan straightened. His eyes had the brightness of someone who had just been given the thing they had been waiting for. Selah did not straighten. She looked at her father's face when he said it, looked for the thing she always looked for, and registered, without being able to name it, that the warmth she expected to find there was not present. It was something that looked like warmth from the outside. She was not sure she could explain the difference. She was not sure she was permitted to feel that she had noticed it. She told herself she was looking in the wrong place. She turned to her assignment. The first analyst died on a Tuesday in February. His name was Daniel Reyes. He was 34, a 7-year Gita veteran, and he had been working a population database query for 11 weeks that he described to his supervisor as a demographic anomaly in rural Montana, unusual birth record patterns, specifically a cluster of registrations with no corresponding hospital documentation, originating from a geographic area with no permanent residential population to account for them. He was methodical and thorough, and he had flagged the anomaly because something in the pattern had produced a response in the professional instinct that 11 weeks of database work had not been sufficient to articulate into a formal report. He died of a cardiac event on his morning run. He was in excellent health. The autopsy found nothing inconsistent with a spontaneous arrhythmia in an otherwise healthy adult male. His case file was absorbed into his team's general workload. Nobody picked up the Montana thread because nobody knew it was a thread. It looked like a folder of incomplete work on a dead man's desk, which is what Thragg had spent 3 months ensuring it looked like. The second analyst died 7 months later. Her name was Christine Park. She had come at the same data cluster from a different angle, not birth records, but medical supply chain logistics, specifically a pattern of pediatric pharmaceutical orders being routed to a distribution node that didn't correspond to any licensed medical facility in the region. She was 2 weeks from generating a report. She died in a traffic accident on Interstate 90. A truck driver, operating on inadequate sleep, drifted into her lane. The truck driver was a real person who made a real error. He was not aware that the route he had been assigned that day placed him on that road at that time, or that the scheduling adjustment that produced his route had originated in a logistics software system that Thragg's network had accessed 14 days earlier. The third died differently. Marcus Webb had not found the data cluster at all. He had been working a financial analysis of the Argall Foundation's subsidiary structures and had identified a specific capital flow that didn't match the stated purpose of the receiving entity. He was not close to understanding what the flow was for. He was close enough that the flow needed to stop. He went hiking in the Cascades and did not come back. Search and rescue found his body 4 days later at the base of a trail feature he had navigated dozens of times. These things happened. The Cascades were full of them every year. The records showed nothing that contradicted this. Cecil sat with 3 folders on his desk and a photograph of each analyst on the wall behind his monitor. He had been sitting with them for 6 weeks, running the connection analysis using different methodologies, looking for the pattern that would hold up. He had not found it. What he had found was this: 3 GD analysts dead in 14 months, each by a different mechanism, each death individually explicable, each one working in a different division on what appeared, from their personnel files, to be entirely unrelated projects. The connection was not in their projects. The connection was in a query string that had briefly appeared in all 3 of their database access logs before being deleted, not by them, but by a system-level process that had the appropriate administrative credentials and had executed the deletion so cleanly that the forensic recovery had taken Cecil's technical team 3 weeks and had still produced only fragments. The query string, as best as they had reconstructed it, was pulling population data from a geographic area in northern Montana. Cecil had not told Mark yet. He needed to understand what he was working with before he had that conversation, because the conversation, once had, would produce a response from Mark that he needed to be able to channel rather than simply witness. He picked up his phone and called Mark. "Come in," he said. "Don't fly. Take a car." Mark sat across from Cecil and looked at the wall, the photographs, the connection map, the fragments of the recovered query string, with the focused attention of someone who was working very hard not to reach a conclusion before the evidence supported it. Cecil walked him through it, all of it, the deaths, the methodology, the timeline, the data gap where the Montana query had been. He was precise and complete, and when he finished he sat back and let Mark have the silence he needed. "That could all be coincidence," Mark said. Not because he believed it. because he needed to hear what Cecil said to it. Yes, Cecil said. It could, and if it's Argall, which it is, he knows you're going to say that. He planned for it. Mark looked at the photographs. You can't act on this. No, you can't even formally open a file on him based on this. 3 deaths that have no forensic connection to him. A deleted query string that points at a geographic area he has no documented presence in. I know what I can't do, Cecil said. That's not what this conversation is. Cecil stood. He went to the window. I've been doing this for 40 years. I have fought things that could pull buildings out of the ground. I have managed threats that would end conversations about the future of the human species. I have never once been afraid of something that hit hard. He turned back. I'm afraid now. Because what Argall is doing, he is doing entirely inside the systems we use to define what a threat is. And when a threat lives inside your definitions can't find it. Mark said, So what do we do? Cecil's answer arrived without pause. I don't know yet. And that is the most frightening thing I have said out loud in 20 years. The meeting in Washington happened in year 6, in the private dining room of a hotel that Thragg had selected, because its acoustic properties made it impossible to surveil from outside, and its ownership structure was 3 degrees removed from anything traceable to him. 3 Viltrumites. All integrated. All, by external assessment, functioning members of the arrangement Mark had constructed after the war. Thragg had spent 2 years cultivating the conditions for this meeting without ever suggesting it should happen. He did not ask them for anything. That was the precision of the approach. He talked about history, the specific, verifiable history of the Viltrumite species, the things they had built, the civilizations they had shaped. He talked about it the way someone talked about a home they had left, not with recruitment energy, but with the register of shared memory between people who came from the same place. One, a warrior named Tev, who had integrated thoroughly and had a life in Auckland she described as genuinely good, listened politely and left. She reported the meeting to Mark the following morning, with the straightforwardness of someone who found the approach transparent enough to be almost insulting. The second, a warrior named Ran who had spent the post-war years in deliberate isolation in rural Iceland, sat through it and went home, and did not think about it again for several weeks. The third was Velik. Velik went home and sat in his apartment in São Paulo for a long time. Then he opened the network channel Thragg had mentioned, casually, as a place where historical Viltrumite documentation had been archived for preservation. He told himself he was looking at it out of historical interest. He watched for 2 hours. He did not report the meeting to Mark. Thragg noted this in his private log without additional commentary. The entry read, The humans have a phrase, boiling a frog. They use it as a warning about incremental threats. What they fail to apply it to is their own condition. Every individual I have neutralized or redirected in the last 5 years fell into the pot, 1 degree at a time. Mark Grayson perceives it. He does not yet know what he is perceiving. That will change, and when it does, I will be ready for what he does next. Petra Vasquez had been inside the Argall Foundation's community programs for 6 months before she sent Cecil her first report expressing genuine concern. The previous 5 had been operational, attendance figures, organizational structure, personnel hierarchies, financial flows she could observe from her position as a volunteer coordinator in the Foundation's Chicago Education Initiative. The 6th was different. It was shorter than the others and had been written, Cecil could tell from the syntax, late at night by someone who had spent several hours deciding whether to send it. The relevant passage read, The people here don't talk about the Foundation the way people talk about a job, or even a cause. They talk about Argall the way my grandmother talked about her parish priest. I sat in on a regional coordinator meeting where a senior staff member referred to a policy decision he'd never been directly involved in making as what Thomas would want. Nobody questioned it. Nobody found it unusual. I'm not saying it's coercive. I'm saying it's organic, and that's what worries me. Cecil sent Petra to a retreat outside Denver and told her to get inside it. She sent one report from the retreat. Then her communications went silent for 11 days. When she re-established contact, she said she was fine, and that she needed a week before she could write it down. The report arrived at 40 pages. She had footnoted it. Cecil sent the summary to Mark with a location and a time. Mark approached from altitude at dusk, coming in from the west where the light made him difficult to track against the sky. The gathering was in a natural bowl in the foothills, several thousand people arranged around a central platform with the organic density of a crowd that had arrived early and chosen its own positions. There were families. There were elderly people in folding chairs. There were young adults who had the specific posture of people who had found their first large thing to believe in. Thomas Argall stood at the center of the platform without a podium, without notes. He wore simple clothing. He spoke in a register that carried across the bowl without appearing to be amplified, though it was. He was talking about the Viltrumite War, not with the managed language he used in public statements. He was talking about it the way someone talked about something they had lived through. He said, "My people," and he said what we did, and he said, "I carry this with the weight of someone for whom these were not rhetorical positions, but ongoing conditions." The crowd was completely still, not the stillness of boredom, but the stillness of people receiving something they had needed to hear, said in exactly this way, by exactly this person. Mark moved through the crowd from the perimeter inward. He stopped beside a man in his 50s, outdoor hands, a jacket with a Union local embroidered on the breast. "What are you doing here?" Mark asked. The man looked at him, listening to the only person who's been honest about all of it. "The war. What we are. What we could be. He's dangerous," Mark said. "He was the leader of the empire that—" "I know who he was," the man said. "He knows who he was. He says it out loud, every time, without anybody asking him to. That's why I trust him. Because he doesn't pretend." Mark had no answer that was adequate, not because the argument was unanswerable, but because its persuasiveness was a designed feature, not an organic conclusion, and he had no way to demonstrate that distinction to someone standing inside it. Argall saw him coming from 40 meters out. He finished the sentence, the paragraph, the thought, with exactly the same attention he would have given it if Mark had not been there, and then he stepped forward and opened his arms in a gesture that was immediately, unmistakably readable to everyone watching. "Welcome, Mark," he said. "I'm glad you came. We need to talk," Mark said. "Privately, of course. Though I'll tell you the same things in private that I'd say here. I have no secrets from these people." He said it without performance, and the crowd registered it with a visible settling, a confirmation. Mark understood, in real time, that he had walked into a room where the walls were made of other people's trust, and that anything he said next would be heard through that material. They moved to the edge of the platform. Mark laid out what Cecil had, the analysts, the pattern, the Montana query. He was as precise as he could be with evidence that he knew as he said it, was not evidence in any formal sense. Argall listened with total patience. When Mark finished, Argall said, "I understand your suspicion. I would be suspicious. What I can offer is this. I will open the compound to any inspection that Jito wants to conduct. Send anyone. Anytime. I have nothing to hide." He said it with the calm of a man who had ensured the compound would be exactly as clean as he was promising. Mark looked at him. "You know what you're doing. I know what I'm offering. An open door. That's all." He held Mark's gaze for one beat. "The question of what's behind it is yours to investigate." The summit was called the Horizon Accord. 3 heads of state, 24 senior diplomats, a rotating cast of advisors, and Thomas Argall, who had co-hosted the event under the banner of the Foundation's International Cooperation Initiative, and whose name appeared on the program directly beneath the Secretary General of the United Nations. The venue was a convention center in Geneva, secured for 6 weeks by a multinational protection detail. The guest list had been vetted at a level that the Swiss government described, in internal communications, as the most thorough pre-event screening they had ever administered. Mark attended because not attending was worse. Cecil had said, "Go. Stay visible. Don't give him an isolated moment. And don't get angry." The fire started at 2:14 p.m. in the East Wing. An electrical fault in a warming unit flagged for replacement 3 months earlier, delayed twice by procurement inertia. There was nothing staged about the fault itself. Thragg had identified it in the building's maintenance records 4 months prior and ensured, through 2 degrees of separation, that the replacement continued to be delayed. He had not created the hazard. He had preserved the conditions for it to express itself at a useful time. Mark was in the East Wing in 30 seconds. He contained the fire in 4 minutes. 3 people had minor injuries. No one died. He came back to the main hall in just under 5 minutes. The corridor outside the Accord's primary briefing room had an intermittent camera reliability issue documented in the venue's technical assessment from 2 weeks prior, flagged for attention, not yet addressed. Thragg had reviewed the technical assessment the day it was filed. At 2:19 p.m., a junior Foundation staff member named Yael Brams was in that corridor. She was 26 years old and believed in the Foundation's mission with the sincerity of someone whose belief had been carefully cultivated and was therefore real. She was moving quickly because the fire alarm had disrupted the afternoon schedule. What happened next occupied 60 seconds that the cameras did not record with complete reliability. Yael Brams was found on the floor of the corridor at 2:21 p.m. by 2 security personnel. Conscious, left shoulder and collarbone injuries consistent with impact from a large, fast-moving object or being. She said she didn't know what had happened. It had been fast. She hadn't seen it clearly. The security personnel filed a report that used the word superhuman in the description of the injury profile. 11 witnesses in adjacent spaces had heard a sound consistent with a high-velocity impact in that corridor during that 60-second window. None of them had direct visual access. Thomas Argall was documented by 2 witnesses as being in a meeting room 40 feet from the corridor entrance at 2:17 p.m. and emerging from it at 2:21 p.m. The 60 seconds between those timestamps were not documented. Thragg had been in the corridor. He had not touched Yael Brams. He had ensured the conditions existed for 60 seconds of ambiguity in a building where the only other superhuman presence was Mark Grayson, who had just returned from the East Wing at a speed multiple witnesses had noted. The Foundation's statement came 40 minutes later. It was not aggressive. It expressed concern for Yael Brams, gratitude for the security team's rapid response, and, in its final paragraph, framed as responsible institutional obligation, the observation that given the nature of the injuries and the circumstances, a full and transparent investigation would serve everyone's interests, including those of all parties present at the summit. It did not name Mark. It did not need to. Argall delivered the statement himself to a small press pool. He wore the expression of a man doing something genuinely painful, not a performance of reluctance, but the register of someone for whom speaking publicly about a serious situation involving someone they had professional respect for was a real cost they were paying because they had determined it was necessary. Mark watched it on a monitor. Then he went to find Argall. Argall was in the main hall. Not hidden, standing in a space where there were people, staff, journalists at the perimeter, 2 camera operators whose equipment was, in both cases, facing the section of room where this conversation was about to happen. Thragg had positioned himself here 11 minutes ago. Mark came across the hall. "You did this," Mark said. His voice was level. "You know exactly what you did." Argall's answer was not anger, not defensiveness. It was sadness, a specific, quiet, visible sadness. the expression of someone who had hoped for a different moment and was receiving this one instead with as much grace as they could manage. It was the most precisely constructed expression Thragg had ever produced. "Mark," he said, "I know you believe that." A pause. "I'm sorry you do." Then he turned. His security closed around him in the way that made continuing the confrontation a logistical problem rather than a social one. He walked toward the diplomatic delegation waiting on the other side of the hall. He did not look back. Mark stood in the center of the hall with the cameras recording him from two angles, his hands at his sides, his face carrying the visible aftermath of a confrontation that the footage would show him initiating, and Argall absorbing with evident pain. Cecil watched all of it and called Mark that evening. "He didn't just close the trap," Cecil said. "He reset it. He's made us the threat, Mark. He didn't defeat our strategy. He made our strategy into his strategy. Is there anything left? There's you and Nolan and Eve and whatever I can still reach that he hasn't gotten to. That's what's left." "That's enough," Mark said. Cecil did not say what he thought about that assessment. He said, "Come in tomorrow. Early, it began at 3:00 am Greenwich Mean Time on a Thursday in November. Not with violence, not with the sound of something breaking. It began with screens. Every major broadcast network on 6 continents experienced a simultaneous signal override at precisely 3 a.m., not a conventional intrusion, but an authorization executed from within their own infrastructure, using credentials that were completely legitimate because the individuals who held them had been cultivated, over years, into positions where they would use those credentials when the moment required it. Most of them did not know, at the moment they used them, that they were part of a coordinated action. They had simply received, through channels they trusted, communication that made using those credentials feel like the correct professional decision in a confusing situation. The global information space did not go dark. It narrowed. The narrowing took 4 minutes and 37 seconds to complete. In Washington, D.C., a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee arrived at his office at 3:15 and to find 3 people waiting for him. People whose professional situations the last 4 years had made into instruments of Thragg's network without any single one of them understanding the full geometry of what they were part of. They delivered the same message being delivered, in calibrated variations, in legislative bodies and regulatory agencies and judicial offices across the planet in the same hour. The message was not a threat. It was an account statement. A precise, documented inventory of the ways in which each recipient's decisions had been shaped, over years by inputs that had originated, through long chains of intermediaries, from Thomas Argall's network. Most of them made the decision that the account statement implied they would make. At 3:47 a.m., Thomas Argall's face appeared on every channel that the Foundation's network controlled, which by that point was most of them. He was not in his public presentation mode. His posture was the posture Mark had seen described in intelligence files, but never witnessed directly. The full, unmediated physical presence of the Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire, carrying itself in a human room with the specific quality of something that had been containing itself for a very long time and had stopped. He spoke for 8 minutes and 40 seconds without notes. He said, "My name is Thragg, Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire, and the last of a bloodline older than your civilization's memory of itself. I want to tell you something true. Everything I have said to you for 6 years about peace, cooperation, and the future of Earth and Viltrum together was accurate. I meant every word. The difference between what you understood and what I intended is simple. You believed I meant these things the way you mean them, as aspirations toward equality. I meant them the way I mean everything, as a description of outcomes I intend to produce. Earth and Viltrum will cooperate. The future is hybrid. The partnership between our species is real." He paused for 3 seconds. "You simply misunderstood who would be governing it. I am not your enemy. I am your administrator." And I am very, very good at what I do." The broadcast ended. The channels returned to their normal programming. 8 minutes and 40 seconds had been sufficient. They came out of the compound at dawn, 19 young people, positioned in the hours before the broadcast in locations adjacent to every major capital city on Earth. They had traveled through the night in vehicles operated by members of Thragg's network. Unremarkable transit, no single movement large enough to flag any monitoring system. They did not attack. They stood. In London, outside the Houses of Parliament. In Beijing. In Moscow. In Washington, New Delhi, Brasilia, Nairobi, Jakarta. In each city, the same message: not violence, not threat, demonstration. Look at what has been built. Look at what was done on your planet, in your cities, over 6 years, without your knowledge. Look at the children. Count them. Understand that this is not the beginning of something. This is the end of a phase that has already completed. Kalan stood outside the United Nations building in New York, in the early morning light with 2 of his younger siblings, and he looked at the building with the specific orientation of someone looking at a place they have been told about for years and are seeing for the first time. He felt his father's plan expressing itself around him like architecture made visible. He did not feel anything wrong about it. He had never been given the materials to build that feeling. Mark saw the broadcast on his phone at 3:52 a.m. He was already moving before it finished. The instinct was physical and immediate. Find Thragg. End it now. Tonight, while the operation was still in its first hours. Nolan stopped him at his front door. Not by force. By position, standing in the doorway with the physical presence of someone who was not going to move, and had thought about why before Mark woke up. He had been awake since 2 a.m., watching the early indicators accumulate in the monitoring data, and had come here because he knew what Mark's first response to the broadcast would be, and he needed to be between Mark and that response before it became a decision. "Not tonight," Nolan said. "Get out of my way, Mark. He's executing right now. Every hour we wait, he has more time to finish the operation. I know the arithmetic." His voice carried the specific weight of someone who had lived inside the thing they were describing. "If you go there alone tonight, those children will be between you and him before you get within 50 meters of the building. And even if you get through them, even if you do that, the cameras show Invincible fighting his way through what looks like teenagers. Everything he built in 6 years about who you are becomes real in 5 minutes of footage." Mark looked at his father. His hands were at his sides, and the effort of keeping them there was visible. "He planned for tonight," Nolan said. "He planned for your first response and your second response, and the conversation you're going to have with Cecil in the morning. He has been planning for all of it since he stepped off that coalition warship." He paused. "We need something he cannot have planned for. We need time to find it." Mark stood in his own doorway and looked at the city beyond his father's shoulder and did not move for a long moment. Then he stepped back inside. "One night," he said. "One night," Nolan agreed. By morning, Cecil had assembled them in a Gita safe house in Maryland, a location 3 degrees removed from any facility Thragg's network had touched. Selected from a list Cecil had maintained for 2 years under a classification so restricted that it had never appeared in any document that left his possession. Mark, Eve, Nolan, Cecil, 2 Gita technical personnel whose loyalty Cecil had personally verified. 6 people. 1 room. A world outside, already restructuring itself around the fact of what had happened overnight. Cecil said, "He planned for this room. He planned for this conversation. He has planned for every conversation we have had in the last 6 years. So the question is, what do we do that he genuinely cannot have planned for?" Nobody spoke. Then Eve said, "He can't plan for the thing he doesn't understand. He spent 6 years studying human emotion as a weapon. He knows what rage does. He knows what love does." She looked at the table. "He does not understand grief." The room waited. "Those children in the compound," she said. "They have human mothers. I need you to find them for me." Eve's operation ran parallel and quieter. She had spent 2 weeks locating the human mothers through the fragments of identity that Thragg's selection process had left in public records. Birth registrations, the edges of financial transactions, the involuntary documentation trail that existed around any human life regardless of how thoroughly someone else tried to manage it. She found 11 of the 19. Of those 11, she made contact with 7. 4 said no. 2 said they needed time they ultimately used to say no. 3 said yes. The 3 who said yes were different from each other in almost every respect except one. They had all independently spent years trying to find something they couldn't name, the child they didn't know they'd had, the relationship that ended without explanation, the specific shape of an absence that had no official documentation because Thragg had ensured that the context of each encounter left no record that would survive a search. Eve met each of them in person and told them the truth in full, without softening it, because softening it would have been its own kind of manipulation, and she had spent enough time studying Thragg's methods to be vigilant about anything that resembled them. All 3 said the same thing in different words. "What can I do?" Eve told them. A voice, a message, delivered through a channel she would arrange. At a moment, she would specify. They would be asked only to be themselves, saying true things to someone who had never heard their voice. She had run the assessment and concluded that Thragg's model had a gap here. He had studied human emotion as an external phenomenon, as a force that moved through populations and produced predictable outputs. He had not adequately modeled the specific effect of a biological parent's voice on a child raised in complete isolation from that parent. He could not model it the way he modeled other variables, because the mechanism was not social. It was older than socialization, embedded at a level that his analytical framework, for all its sophistication, had no adequate language for. She built the channel carefully. She tested it twice. She kept it ready. They hit the compound at 4:20 a.m. on a Wednesday. Mark went through the eastern perimeter. Nolan took the western approach. The support staff and security personnel they encountered in the first 4 minutes were handled with controlled, precise minimum force. Nobody killed, nobody permanently damaged, each person taken down cleanly and secured. The compound's alarm system activated at 4:03 a.m. The hybrid children came out of the residential structures in the specific configuration of people who had practiced this. They were not panicking. They were not disorganized. They moved with the cohesion of a unit that had trained together in this environment for years and had internalized its geometry. Who covered which approach? Who provided secondary support? Who protected the younger children in the innermost residential structure, while the eldest managed the perimeter response? They covered gaps for each other without communication because communication was unnecessary. They knew where everyone would be. Mark got through the first line of the perimeter response in 4 minutes. It cost him, not catastrophically but meaningfully, in the way that fighting people who were genuinely trying to stop you always cost you something, and these people were genuinely trying, with the full commitment of individuals defending their home and their family. He did not let himself think about what that meant. He kept moving. Kalan found him in the central corridor of the main building. He was not in an attack posture. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his face carrying the expression of someone who had decided to try something before they tried anything else. "You can stop this," Kalan said. "Walk away. My father will give you terms. He respects you. He always has." Mark looked at him, at the Viltrumite architecture of his face and the fully human expressiveness underneath it, and knew the respect Kalan attributed to his father was real as a belief, regardless of its accuracy as a fact. "He doesn't respect anything," Mark said. "He doesn't know how. You don't know him. I know exactly who he is. And so do you, if you've ever looked at yourself and wondered why he looks at you the same way he looks at a weapon." Something moved across Kalan's face. Not doubt, not yet, not enough. but the specific micro-expression of someone whose framework has just been asked to accommodate something it wasn't built to hold. It lasted less than a second. Then he attacked. He was genuinely, technically good, Thragg had ensured that, and the emotional intensity behind his commitment produced a physical amplification that cost Mark real damage in the first exchange. Mark answered it with controlled precision, going past rather than through. He hurt Kalan without finishing it, because finishing it was a line he couldn't cross and remain the thing he was trying to be. He hated the calculation even as he executed it. Sayla was in the secondary corridor when Eve's channel opened. She heard it on the device Eve had placed in her communication system 3 days earlier, a passive relay dormant until this moment. She heard a voice she had never heard before say her name. Not Sayla, her other name, the name on the birth record that Thragg had filed and she had never been shown. Her mother said, "I missed you. I thought about you every day. I didn't know. I'm so sorry I didn't know." Sayla stood in the corridor while the compound moved around her. Alarms, the sound of the fight in the eastern section, the voices of her siblings coordinating through practiced channels. She stood completely still. The stillness lasted 7 seconds. It was Thragg's stillness, inherited and expressing in her as the outward sign of an internal architecture failing to process something it had not been built to process. Then she made a choice. She did not fight for Mark. She did not turn against her siblings or her father or the life she had been built inside. She lowered her hands. She stepped to the side of the corridor. She let him pass. It was one young woman choosing not to throw herself at a wall. But her authority in the compound's internal hierarchy was real, and 3 of the younger ones, seeing Sayla step aside, stopped. A section of the compound's organized resistance lost its coherence. It was enough. Mark and Nolan converged at the entrance to the central operations room. The corridor behind them was quiet in the specific way of a fight that has found its resolution without anyone formally declaring it. Nolan stood beside his son and looked at the door. Whatever he says in there, whatever he offers, remember what he is. He will try to find one more door for us to walk through. I know you know. I needed to say it anyway. They went in. The room was exactly what Thragg was. No personal effects. No accumulated comfort objects. No photographs. No the small material sediment that human habitation deposited in every space it occupied over time. A desk with a single monitor. 3 chairs arranged for utility rather than conversation. One window positioned to provide light without view. The walls were bare and the surfaces were clean and the room communicated, with the precision of a designed thing, that the mind which occupied it required nothing from its environment except function. Thragg was standing. He had been standing for some time, long enough that a human being would have shifted weight, adjusted posture, found some small physical accommodation for the duration. He had not moved. He was wearing the suit he had chosen for the broadcast, and he was looking at the door with the expression he wore when he was not producing an expression for a purpose. Mark and Nolan came through the door, and Thragg watched them enter with the specific attention of someone who had been waiting and was now running the first real-time assessment of the operation's outcome through the data their arrival represented. The timing. The physical condition they were in. What it implied about the state of the compound outside this room. "I expected you approximately 3 hours ago," he said. "The delay suggests complications I didn't fully account for. I'll note that." Mark said, "There won't be a next iteration." Thragg looked at him. "That is what you said about the Viltrumite Empire." He took off his jacket. He folded it with the same attention he gave everything, precisely, without wasted motion, and placed it on the chair nearest the desk. He removed his cufflinks, his tie. He rolled his sleeves to the elbow, each fold exact and even. Every action unhurried. Every action the action of someone who was not performing calm because calm was not a performance he needed to produce. The work of preparing for a fight that might level the building was, to him, no different in its internal texture than the work of preparing for a meeting. "I want you to understand something before we begin," he said. "I have not failed. The compound continues. The network exists. My children are alive. What you have done tonight is accelerate my timeline by several years. I am adjusting." "You're not adjusting anything," Mark said. Something behind Thragg's eyes changed. Not expression, not feeling, but the specific quality of a mind removing its last operational layer. The Thomas Argyle architecture, which had been present in everything about him for 6 years, was gone. What was left was what had always been underneath it. The Grand Regent, 3,000 years old, the fullest expression of what the Viltrumite species had produced at its apex, standing in a small room in Montana, preparing to do the one thing he had always been most completely built for. "No," he said. "I suppose not." He moved first. Not at Mark, at Nolan. The assessment was immediate and correct. Nolan was the strategic variable that Mark's model depended on. Nolan had centuries of Viltrumite combat experience that Mark did not. And more critically, Nolan understood how Thragg thought in a way that Mark could approximate, but not fully access. Disrupting Nolan first created a degraded version of the partnership he was facing. Nolan read the vector and was already moving when Thragg crossed the distance. The exchange that resulted lasted 4 seconds and covered the length of the room. Thragg's strike redirected, Nolan's counter partially absorbed, both of them reading each other with the specific quality of combatants who were not unfamiliar with each other's architecture. Thragg had shaped the doctrine Nolan had been built on. He knew its grammar the way a writer knew their own sentences. Mark came in from the left with a strike at full extension aimed at the base of Thragg's skull. Thragg moved his head 4 inches. The strike caught his shoulder instead. He used the momentum of the impact to complete a rotation that put him behind Mark's extended arm, and from that position he delivered a strike to Mark's kidney region that drove him 2 steps forward and into the wall. "You're leading with your left when Nolan is on your right," Thragg said. His voice was the same as it was in the broadcast. Measured, unhurried. "You've been doing that since the Viltrumite War. I documented it." Mark came off the wall. He did not answer. The fight moved. The room could not contain it. The first major exchange took out the desk, the monitor, the window, and a section of the exterior wall, and after that the compound's courtyard became the arena and then the tree line beyond it, each exchange displacing them further from the building, as the force involved required more space to express itself, without destroying everything in a 20-meter radius. Nolan fought with something Mark could feel in his peripheral awareness, a quality in his father's movement he identified, after the third exchange, as grief. Not grief that slowed him, grief that made every strike carry a specific weight, the weight of a man who was fighting the version of himself he had chosen not to remain, and who felt the full cost of that choice in every contact with the thing he had once been adjacent to. They had come from the same place. They had been made by the same doctrine. The distance between where they had both started and where they had each arrived was the entire moral history of what Nolan Grayson had chosen. Thragg felt it too. He used it. "You fight like a man apologizing," Thragg said, during a grapple that lasted 6 seconds before Nolan broke it. "That has always been your limitation. You chose sentiment, and you named it strength. The results are visible." Nolan answered this not with words, but with a shift, a fundamental change in his approach that Thragg did not fully predict. Because the shift was not tactical. It was the specific movement of someone who had decided to stop carrying the grief as a weight and start carrying it as fuel. He attacked with something that had no Viltrumite name because Viltrumite doctrine had no category for it. The total commitment of a person fighting for the specific future they chose over the one they were built for. Thragg took the hit. It was the hardest single impact he had absorbed in the fight so far. He registered it, assessed it, and recalibrated. Mark's left arm broke in the 9th minute. A controlled strike from Thragg, placed during a moment when Mark had both hands engaged in a grapple redirect, the elbow joint taken at the precise angle of maximum structural fragility, the break clean and complete. Mark reset without stopping. The arm was wrong, and he knew it, and he continued, because stopping was not available to him as a choice right now. Thragg drove him into the earth twice in the following 3 minutes. The first time, Mark came out in 4 seconds. The second time, 6. The third time Thragg tried it, Mark came out faster than he'd gone in, and what he came out with was different from what he'd gone in with. Thragg assessed the change in real time. Something in Mark's output had altered, not the raw force, which was consistent, but the quality of its application. The tactical overhead had dropped. The constant processing load of fighting smart had simplified into something that had fewer moving parts, and was therefore faster and harder to predict. It was not recklessness. It was commitment without remainder. 6 years of compressed and documented and impotent fury behind it that was not reactive anymore, but specific. Specific to this person, this moment, this ending. Thragg had no adequate model for it, because the conditions that produced it were conditions he could not experience. He identified the gap in his model. He could not close it. He moved to the contingency. Kalan had followed them. He arrived at the tree line as the fight's 14th minute began, positioned in the space between Thragg and Mark's next vector of approach. Thragg saw him arrive. He adjusted the fight's geometry by 2 degrees. The adjustment placed Kalan's position directly in the path that Mark would need to move through to close the distance for his next engagement. Not a shield, a variable that his assessment of Mark indicated would produce a hesitation of approximately 1 to 2 seconds, and 1 to 2 seconds against a combatant of Thragg's caliber was a fight-ending interval. Mark saw Kalan. He checked. The check lasted 1 beat. 1 beat where the fight's momentum shifted, and Thragg moved, and Nolan, understanding what was happening faster than conscious processing could have delivered the understanding, threw himself into Thragg's path, and took the strike that had been intended for Mark's exposed position. Nolan hit the ground hard. He did not get back up immediately. The damage was real and significant, and he was still moving, still conscious, still functioning. But he was out of the fight's next 10 seconds, which were the 10 seconds that mattered. Mark looked at Kalan, not with rage, not with the tactical assessment of a combatant evaluating an obstacle. "Get out," he said. "Right now." "Please." The word arrived in Kalan's framework without a location to go. His father did not say please. Thragg's network did not say please. Please was not a word in the vocabulary of the world he had been built inside, and its sudden presence in the voice of the person across from him produced a fracture in the geometry of the moment that his conditioning had not prepared him for. He moved. Not away from Mark, sideways, out of the line, because sideways was what his body chose when his framework stopped providing direction. Mark moved. What happened in the following 4 minutes was an accumulation reaching its threshold. Thragg was the most powerful Viltrumite alive. The fight had not changed that fact. What the fight had changed was the operational context around that fact. Nolan was down, which removed the cycling structure, but Mark was no longer cycling. He was doing one thing with everything he had. Thragg blocked. He countered. He landed strikes that would have ended any other fight several times over. Mark did not end. Thragg felt the arithmetic changing. He ran the projection and arrived at a conclusion he had not arrived at since before the Viltrumite War. He had reached the boundary of his model. He had not adequately calculated for what a person became after 6 years of learning to fight something they couldn't reach through any conventional means. He made the decision with the same cold clarity he brought to every decision. "Stop," he said. Mark did not stop. "Listen to me." I have 19 children. Half of them are under the age of 8. If I die here, they have no one. You cannot harm children, neither of you. I know you. What happens to them is your responsibility if you make this choice. Give me terms. It was not manipulation. It was the honest offer of a man who had run his projections and found one remaining viable path and was pursuing it with complete commitment. The argument was not fabricated. The children were real. Their situation was real. The moral weight of it landed exactly where Thragg had calculated it would land. Nolan said, "From the ground, I know what you're saying. It doesn't change what this is." Mark looked at Thragg. "The children will be taken care of. I promise." "A promise from, I know what it is to you," Mark said. "It's all you're getting." Thragg looked at him for one long moment. The stillness that had defined him across 6 years, across 3,000 years, arrived one final time, but different in its quality from every previous instance. Not the stillness of calculation. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a mind that had reached the end of its projections and was looking at the space beyond them with the first genuinely unplanned attention of its existence. Mark stepped forward. The room was quiet when it was over. Not the quiet of something ending cleanly, the specific weighted quiet of something that took a long time and cost what it cost, and was now simply finished. The way a storm was finished. The way the last note of something was finished. The walls had not survived the fight intact. 2 of them were partially open to the Montana pre-dawn, and the cold came through without ceremony. And the stars above the tree line were the same stars that had been there before any of this began, unmarked by what had happened beneath them. Mark stood in what remained of the room. What it had taken to get here was written in his body in a language that required no translation. The left arm set wrong at the elbow, the laceration across his jaw that was closing slowly in the way Viltrumite biology closed things when it had been asked to do too much in too short a span. The specific exhaustion that lived below the physical damage and was older and heavier than any of it. He had been carrying it for 6 years. He would carry some of it for considerably longer. That was the correct understanding. He did not resist it. He did not feel what people who had not done this imagined you felt when you finished it. He felt the weight. That was all. The weight of what had been required, and the weight of what came next, and the clear, cold understanding that the second weight was larger than the first. The hard part had not been tonight. The hard part was the 6 years before tonight, and the hard part was also everything that came after, and he was standing in the interval between them, in a room with open walls and stars overhead, and no adequate words. He stayed in the room for a while. Not long. Long enough. Then he went out to find his father. Nolan was in the courtyard, sitting against the exterior wall of the main building with his legs extended and his hands in his lap. His healing was progressing in the visible, incremental way of someone whose biology was working hard on a significant debt. He looked up when Mark came through the damaged wall section and said nothing for a moment, reading what Mark's face had to tell him. Then he said, "Sit down." Mark sat beside him on the ground. The Montana pre-dawn was cold, and the compound around them was quiet, in a way that was different from the quiet before the operation, not the quiet of a place at rest, but the quiet of a place that had been through something and had not yet determined what it was now. "He was the best we ever produced," Nolan said. "The fullest expression of what we were built to be, and he lost." "Because of you," Mark said. "Because you changed." Nolan looked at the sky above the tree line. He didn't account for change. In all those centuries of Viltrumite history, no one had ever changed in a way that mattered to his models. He built his projections on data that was, until me, completely consistent. He built his models on what we were, Mark said, not on what we chose. They sat with that for a moment. He might have won, Nolan said, if he'd had another year, maybe 2. "I know, that should bother you." "It does," Mark said. "It's going to keep bothering me. He looked at the sky. I think that's probably correct. Eve had restored the compound's external broadcast connection at 5:17 am. She had made the decision without consulting Mark, which she had known he would not have instructed her to do, and which she had determined was necessary regardless. She had spent 6 years watching Thragg construct narratives in public space, watching him use the information environment as architecture. The response to that was not to leave the information environment unaddressed. The response was to put the truth in it, and let the truth do what Thragg's constructions had never been able to do. Because they were constructions. Hold. The compound's interior footage, the operations room, the tactical displays, the documented evidence of what Thragg had been building and how, went out on every channel that was still running the previous night's broadcast. It went out raw and unedited, and it ran for 40 minutes before the first institutional response managed to interrupt it. 40 minutes was sufficient. The Argyle Foundation's Community Programs Director, a woman named Rosa Fielding, who had spent 4 years running genuine education initiatives and who had, in the previous 18 hours, experienced the specific devastation of discovering that the institution she had dedicated herself to was a designed instrument, released a public statement at 6:00 am that was 43 words long and said everything it needed to say. 14 senior Foundation staff members co-signed it before noon. The cult did not dissolve. Thragg had understood human psychology accurately enough to know it would not. Belief systems of that density and duration did not resolve cleanly, even under the weight of complete evidential refutation. What happened instead was a fracture, visible and real and painful, the specific violence of people confronting the truth of something they had organized their lives around. Some left immediately. Some took weeks. Some took months. Some, a smaller number that decreased over time but never reached zero, maintained some version of what they had believed, not in Argyle as a real person, but in what they had needed him to represent, which was a different and more complicated problem that no single revelation could solve, and that would require patient, sustained effort from people who understood the mechanism and were not tired of dealing with it. Cecil sat with the failure review for 2 days before he let anyone else into the building. Not as self-punishment, as discipline. The review was comprehensive. Every decision point where earlier action might have changed the outcome, every intelligence gap that Thragg had created or exploited, every institutional assumption that had been turned against the institution that held it. He wrote it all down in the specific, clear language of someone who intended it to be read by people who came after him and needed to understand what this had cost and why and what not to do again. On the 3rd day, he called his deputy in and said, "We were looking for something that fought like a Viltrumite. We need to start building systems to find things that think like one." His deputy said, "What does that look like?" "Slower," Cecil said. "It looks considerably slower and more difficult than what we've been doing." Schedule a full methodology review. I want new protocols for identifying institutional infiltration, financial network analysis, and long-horizon political corruption. We have 6 years of Thragg's operational data to build from. He placed the failure review on the desk in front of the deputy. "Start here." The children were in the central hall when Mark came back inside. Not all of them. Some of the youngest were in the residential structures with support staff who had remained to ensure the children were cared for. But the eldest ones were in the hall, gathered in the specific configuration of people who have been through something together and are now in the uncertain interval before they know what it means. Kalan was at the far end of the room. He was sitting with 2 of his younger siblings, one on each side of him, and he was not saying anything. He was holding the younger one's hand with the mechanical, automatic care of someone performing a function, because the function needed to be performed regardless of what they were experiencing internally. His face was the face of someone who has had the architecture of their world removed without being given anything to replace it, and who is still standing because the body does not wait for the mind to catch up. He looked up when Mark came in. Mark crossed the room and crouched down in front of him, not standing over him, not maintaining the posture of authority. At eye level. The younger sibling on Kalan's right looked at Mark with the wide, uncertain attention of a young child trying to read a situation through the adults around them. "You said you'd take care of them," Kalan said. His voice was steady in the way voices were steady, when the steadiness was costing something real. "Yes," Mark said. "He's gone." "Yes." Kalan looked at him for a long time with the searching intensity that was the most human thing about him. Looking for something to be angry at that was adequate to what he was feeling, and not finding it in the form he needed. Because what he was feeling was too large and too new for the framework he'd been given to hold it. The framework had been designed for conviction and action and the specific exhilaration of a prepared purpose. It had not been designed for this, the open, uncertain space that appeared when the purpose turned out to have been someone else's. "What happens to us?" he said. Not a challenge. A genuine question from someone who had been told, for their entire life, that the answer to that question was already decided, and who was now holding the question for the first time without an answer attached to it. "That's something we figure out together," Mark said. "If you'll let me help." Sela appeared in the doorway behind him. She had heard what was said, and she came forward and sat beside Kalan and put her arm around the younger sibling on his left. And the four of them stayed like that for a while. Two half-Viltrumite young people who were something the universe had not fully categorized yet. One young child who did not understand what was happening, but understood that the people she trusted were close. And Mark Grayson, who had no adequate words and did not try to find any. The mothers came in the weeks that followed. Not all three. One decided she needed more time, and Mark told her there was no timeline and meant it. The other two came to the compound separately, with the specific mixture of terror and determination of people doing something they had decided to do before they had figured out how to do it. Sela's mother arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. She was a woman named Lena, ordinary in every external respect. The specific ordinariness of a person who had built a real life around an absence they had never been able to explain. She stood in the compound's central hall and looked at her daughter across 15 feet of floor. Sela looked back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Sela took one step forward. And then another, and her mother crossed the remaining distance, and what happened when they reached each other was private in a way that Mark, standing in the doorway, understood was not his to witness. He left. He pulled the door closed behind him. He stood in the compound's exterior and looked at the Montana mountains in the morning light and felt the weight he had been carrying redistribute itself slightly. Not lifting, not resolving, but shifting into a configuration that was different from what it had been before. Less like a burden and more like a structure. Something you didn't set down, something you learned to build around. The question the compound raised for the months and years that followed was not a simple one. 19 children, raised in a program they had believed in, whose entire worldview had been constructed by a person who had not built it to serve them. The fact that the program was over did not resolve what the program had produced. The question of who these children were, what they owed to what they'd been made to believe, and what they owed to the human inheritance that had always been moving through them beneath everything else, was a question that would not answer itself in any short interval. Mark knew this. He had committed to the interval regardless, because that is what a commitment was. He went back to the city 2 weeks later, not with a statement, not with a press conference or a formal return to active duty, or any of the institutional markers that Cecil had offered to arrange. He went back the way he had always worked best, alone, at altitude, in the early morning when the city was shifting between its nighttime and daytime configurations, and the sky above it was the specific gray-blue of a world getting ready to begin. He flew over it for a long time before he did anything. Not surveying, not calculating. Just being present in the space above the thing he had spent 6 years trying to protect in ways that went beyond fighting, And that had survived, not unchanged, not unscathed, not without cost, but here. Alive, still itself, underneath everything that had happened to it. The city did not know what it had almost been. It was busy being what it was, which was the thing about it that had always mattered most to the people who chose it, and to the people who could not accept losing it. A building alarm went off in the financial district. Standard response. He was moving before the second cycle. He went down into the city. The sky above him closed back over the space where he had been, the way it always did, the way it would always do. Indifferent and enormous and completely unchanged by anything that happened beneath it. The city did not know what it had almost been. It was busy living. He went to work. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.